Our participants joining us online have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A chat pod, and we're going to go ahead and answer as many questions as we can during this session. And with that, our first question is for Christopher. So Christopher, can the 3 years exclusivity for new clinical trials be added to the 5-year exclusivity for...
Hi, good morning. Happy to be here and answer that question. So the 5-year new chemical entity period would begin at approval of the NDA that contains the NCE. If the applicant got approval of a supplement that qualified for 3-year exclusivity, the 3 years actually begins to run from the supplemental approval. So it could be concurrent actually with the 5-year exclusivity, or it could come after the 5-year exclusivity. All depends when that second supplement that was eligible for 3-year exclusivity was approved. So I'll give you an example. If the supplement that was eligible for 3-year exclusivity was approved 1 year after the NDA containing the new chemical entity was approved, then the 3 years would actually expire before the 5-year period expired, because it would run from year 1 to 4.
Great, thank you, Christopher. We have another question for you. If 2 applications submitted under 505B with NCE, one will most probably be approved before the other. Does this mean that the second approval will not be eligible to NCE exclusivity, although at the time of submission there was no FDA-approved product with the NCE?
Sure, thank you. So yes, that's correct. The second application would not be eligible for its own period of new chemical entity exclusivity. However, under the umbrella policy that Nisha described in her presentation, 505B2 applications and NDAs would still be blocked if they were were submitted for that same new chemical entity. So in sort of practice, the second application would benefit from the exclusivity of the first application.
Great, thank you, Christopher. Our next question is for Nisha. Can you clarify how exclusivity would be determined and or granted for fixed combination NDA as described in CDER map 5018.2? When at least one of the active moieties is classified as a new molecular entity, the NDA is classified as a type 1. For application, is the NDA eligible for 5 or 3 years exclusivity? Additionally, when none of the active moieties is a new molecular entity, but at least one is a new active ingredient, the NDA is classified as a type 2 for application. Is the NDA eligible for 5 or 3 years exclusivity?
Sure. I just want to briefly describe the map for those not familiar with it. So map 50182, 5018.2 describes our NDA classification code, and it describes the agency's thinking and thinking in when we would assign a particular code for an NDA. So type 1 a type 1 is given to applications that contain a new molecular entity, and generally an NME is an NCE. So under our NCE exclusivity for fixed combination guidance that I described in the presentation, if a combination contains an NCE and at least one previously approved active moiety, then it would qualify, the application would qualify for 5-year NCE exclusivity. And usually these fixed combinations with one NCE and one previously approved active moiety, they're classified, they have an NDA classification code of 1 and 4. So generally, if it's an application with that classification, then it would generally be awarded 5-year NCE exclusivity. So type 2 NDAs are for new active ingredients, and generally for a new active ingredient, the active moiety has been previously approved. So a type 2 NDA would not generally get 5-year NCE exclusivity, but it could qualify for 3-year exclusivity if it meets the regulatory and statutory criteria. So a type 2/4 fixed combination product would generally not be eligible for 5-year exclusivity, but could be eligible for 3-year exclusivity.
Great, thank you so much, Nisha. Our next question is for Truong. Can a drug product have more than exclusivity granted at the same time?
Yeah, so for drug products that are new, and sometimes they might have like a new strength or new formulations, that one usually gets grouped into one exclusivity, like we would call that a new drug product. So that would be considered as one exclusivity.
Great, thank you. We have another question for you. I saw an exclusivity code M244 for sitagliptin, exclusivity section in the Orange Book. What does
So the M code is considered a miscellaneous exclusivity code, and you can also look at in our exclusivity code with definitions. Basically, that code tells you that it's exclusivity granted to the drug product, but it doesn't fall in other categories that we currently have, like new products or new patient population. So it's technically a miscellaneous code that still that we still grant exclusivity to.
Great, thank you. We have another question for you. In the section of exclusivity for the same product, there is exclusivity expiring in 2022. What does
So for exclusivities that you see on the, I believe on the right-hand column, if it says that the exclusivity expires in 2022, that means that the exclusivity that's assigned to will expire that 2022 date, and then any firm or applicant that's looking at the exclusivity would need to adhere to that, follow that date.
Great, thank you. Our next question is for Alicia. Alicia, you mentioned that GAIN and other exclusivities can be added to any exclusivity for a drug. Can these exclusivities be applied at the end of an NCE exclusivity for?
Thank you for the question. So yes, they can be added to the end of the NCE exclusivity. So I'll give you an example. Say that there's an NCE that expires in June 2025 for a product, and then it also, upon its approval, receives a GAIN exclusivity. In that case, the 2025 expiration for NCE would then expire in 2030 with the GAIN extension. And then in addition to that, if they also received a pediatric extension with that initial approval, then they could get an additional 6 months with the GAIN and PEDS together. So in that situation, then it would be December 2030 as the final expiration date.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is for Nisha. Could you please discuss the role of the Exclusivity Board in determining exclusivities, specifically for other exclusivities such as GAIN, Orphan, and 180-day? and how the board interacts with OND, OOPD, and other CDER.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So the board is involved, as I mentioned during the presentation, in the more complex exclusivity determinations, and we work with all of the various offices at FDA, including Office of New Drugs, Office of Generic Drugs, Office of Pharmaceutical Quality, in making a recommendation on a particular exclusivity matter. So if there is a clinical question, we would consult with the relevant office in the Office of New or relevant review team in the Office of New Drugs. If it pertains to a new chemical entity, we would consult with the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality in CDER. So that's generally how we work. I mean, we are a board, a group of FDA staff from various CDER offices, and we will consult as necessary, or consult certain questions as necessary. And then with respect to the other exclusivities that are not 5-year or 3-year exclusivity, we do work with the other FDA offices, such as the office, such as OOPD, if there's some issue that could affect both orphan drug exclusivity and new chemical entity exclusivity. We work hand in hand. We collaborate with them to make sure that our decisions are consistent. That's generally how the board works.
Great, thank you. And another question for you. What period of exclusivity would be granted for prodrugs? How much period of exclusivity would be granted for prodrugs, whether it's considered as a new molecular entity or a 505(b)(2)?
Sure. So as I mentioned in the presentation, under Section 505U, certain prodrugs, I'm sorry, I'm mixing it up. So for prodrugs, it depends on whether they could qualify for 5-year NCE exclusivity. So in the Actavis case, the drug was lisdexamfetamine. It was a prodrug of a previously approved active, but when we looked at the chemical structure of lisdexamfetamine, we looked at the chemical structure and then determined what the active moiety was just based on the chemical structure, and we determined that it qualified for 5-year NCE exclusivity. Now the class or the category of the application, 505B1 or 505B2, NDA doesn't really factor in whether an application qualifies for 5-year exclusivity. We have determined that, or we have recognized 5-year exclusivity for 505B2 NDAs. So in determining whether a drug qualifies for exclusivity, we just focus on the active moiety.
Great, thank you so much. And another question for you. What is the difference between a new chemical entity and a new molecular entity?
Sure. So new molecular entity and new chemical entity are sometimes used interchangeably, but they are distinct. So we define what a new chemical entity is in our regulations, which I had provided in my slide deck. So it's a drug that contains no active moiety that's been approved by FDA in any application submitted under Section 505B. And the term NME is not defined in the statute or regulations, but an NME is an active ingredient that contains no active moiety that has been previously approved by the agency in an application under Section 505, or that has not been previously marketed as a drug in the United States. So our map 5018.2 on the NDA classification codes, it actually describes the two. So if you weren't able to jot down what the differences were, you can always refer to that map and it explains the difference.
Great, thank you so much, Nisha. Our next question is for Christopher. Can a 505(b)(2) applicant who is relying solely on bioequivalent studies submit with FDA before the NCE1 date to submit Ndas?
Hi, thank you for the question. Yeah, so the answer is that any 505(b)(2) application that contains the protected NCE would be affected by the 5-year exclusivity period. So they would not be able to submit before the NCE-1 date.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have another question for you. Is the exclusivity applied for both small molecules or big molecules like monoclonal?
Thank you. Yeah, so the exclusivities that we described in the presentation today are for small molecule products, non-biological drugs that are approved under Section 505 of the FD&C Act. There are separate periods of exclusivity for biological products under Section 351 of the Public Health Service Act that we hadn't discussed today, and they're not actually noted in the orange book. They can be found in the purple book. So I guess that's a topic for another day.
Thank you, Christopher. Our next question is for Truong. Our new NDA was just approved by the FDA. Can you explain why exclusivity has not yet been listed in the orange?
So thanks for the question. Exclusivities are updated on a monthly update date. So the best way is that you can check the electronic orange book for the updates, or you can email the orange book for updates on your exclusivities.
Thank you so much. We have another question for you. How is an NDA holder notified if their application has received a period of exclusivity?
So as I noted before, no letters are sent to the applicant holders to indicate that the period of exclusivity has attached to their application. So the posting of exclusivity information is officially in the orange book. So you would look in there.
Thank you. And we have a question for Nisha again. What does essential to approval mean in the context of 3-year exclusivity?
Okay, great. Thanks for the question. So essential to approval is defined in our regulation, and I've included the definition in the slide deck just for your reference. But it generally means that there are no other data available that could support approval of the NDA. So the data in the clinical investigation must be vital. In the new clinical investigation must be vital to support approval of the NDA. And we have denied exclusivity on the basis that a sponsor's BA study alone supported approval, and therefore a sponsor's phase 3 study was not deemed essential to approval. And also there may be published literature that supports approval, and therefore a new clinical investigation may not be essential for approval of an application.
Thank you. We have another question for you from the audience. Can exclusivity for a new indication be granted whether under a new 505(b)(2) or a new supplemental NDA?
Okay, thanks for the question. So an application that is seeking approval of a new indication can qualify for 3-year exclusivity regardless of whether the new indication is submitted in an original 505B2 or 505B1 NDA or a supplement to a 505B NDA. As long as it meets the statutory and regulatory criteria, it doesn't really matter when the applicant is seeking approval of that new indication, whether in the original or in a supplement.
Great, thank you. And we have another question for you. What are the differences between patents and exclusivity?
Okay, great, thanks. So both patents and exclusivity are meant to provide a period of market protection for an innovative drug for a certain period. However, there are differences between the two. Patents are constitutionally guaranteed property rights that are administered by the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Patents exclude others from making or using for sale or selling the invention in the United States. The patent term is generally 20 years from the date on which the application was first filed with the USPTO, and they can be granted at any time during the development, during the lifetime of a drug, and can encompass a wide range of claims. And as discussed at yesterday's panel sessions, FDA has a ministerial role with respect to patents. On the other hand, exclusivity is a protection created by statute, and it's a bar on submission of applications for follow-on products or FDA's approval of such applications. It's administered by the FDA, and it depends. The timing, unlike patents, which are generally for 20 years, the period of exclusivity depends on the innovation, and it's recognized at the time of approval of an application.
Great, thank you. And we actually have another question for Christopher. If there is orphan drug exclusivity, does this prevent submission of an NDA 505B2 or only the approval of the product until that expires?
Thank you. So the answer is that orphan exclusivity is a bar on approval. So it does not prevent submission of the 505B2 application. It only prevents approval of that application for the orphan protected condition or use.
Great, thank you. And we have another question for Nisha. Is 505B2, are those products eligible for orphan exclusivity?
Yes, 505B2 NDAs can qualify for orphan drug exclusivity as long as it meets the statutory and regulatory standards for orphan drug exclusivity, which I believe will be discussed in the next section.
Great, thank you. And we have another question for you. How should NDA holders or applicants make their request for exclusivity?
Great. We actually get this question quite a bit. So our regulations at 21 CFR 314.50J state that an applicant requesting exclusivity must include a statement claiming which exclusivity its product qualifies for and provide a justification in their NDA. So I think ideally it would really be great if the applicant would go into detail why it meets the standard for exclusivity, whatever exclusivity they are requesting. like for 3-year exclusivity, for example, if the applicant went into detail about how it meets each criteria, whether it submitted the application contains a new clinical investigation and they refer which investigation they believe would qualify, how they can demonstrate that they've conducted or sponsored the investigation, why they believe it's essential to approval. If applicants can lay out the justification, and that goes a long way in helping us make a speedy determination on whether an application qualifies for exclusivity.
Great, thank you. And our last question is going to be for Christopher. How can an ANDA applicant how can they confirm, for example, the specific conditions that are protected by an NDA's exclusivity?
Hi, thank you. So I would say as a starting point, consult the Orange Book to see what code has been given. So there may be, for example, an I code describing an indication, a D code describing dosing, or an M code which would describe miscellaneous labeling updates, and then take a look at the labeling of the NDA and try to assess where you would see potentially protected conditions of use. And then if you have a question after that, I would suggest contacting the regulatory project manager who might be able to help find you some assistance from our Division of Labeling Review in terms of what needs to be carved out if you're seeking to do a carve out.
Great, thank you, Christopher, Alicia, Truong, and Nisha for answering so many questions and for your presentations. With that, we are going to close our panel discussion and move to break. We hope to see all of our attendees back at 10:45 when we will resume with our next presentation.